So, all right. Now, going down to the kind of the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic in terms of self-inquiry. What do we bring to this work and to this, which I'll go through in a minute. This is a series of questions, and I can send this out by email. And it's the things that I like to ask myself before I set up anything like this. Or I mentioned heart steading very briefly in the first presentation, and it has to do with forming wisdom groups, support groups, problem solving, collaborative inquiry, things like that, to do work in the world. And so before I do anything like that, I like to check in with myself. So I'm just going to give you these questions. The first one, and these are not in any particular order, but have you imagined the vision that you're working for so well that it actually lives in you? Have you imagined it so well that it actually lives in you as an imaginal being, appearing in your dreams, it being in your body? I've often found that when I've asked people, what is it that you're struggling for or fighting for or creating or what have you, people often can't articulate that. And so a lot of it gets left in the unconscious, and that's problematic for a lot of reasons. So does your vision actually live in you? Whatever it is you want to envision. Just societies, inclusive groups of community, a world that's healing, whatever it is, does it actually pull you? Is your unconscious intent aligned with your conscious intent? Now, as Jung pointed out, unconscious means unknown. That's the way it's unconscious. You can't see it directly. So that's why psychology invents all these techniques for getting at that kind of material, watching our dreams, looking for what Jung called synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem to have a message for us, all kinds of different indicators, the way people behave toward us, things like this. So is your conscious and unconscious aligned? I wish more people doing work in the world would ask these kinds of questions, by the way. This is partly where they come from, because they don't. And then they get burned out, or their reform work or activism has unintended consequences that don't look too good, that sort of thing. Here's another one. Do you have a sense of you apart from what you're trying to bring into being? Do you have a sense of yourself apart from your, however you call it, project, campaign, struggle, visionary work, reform work, whatever it is? Because if you don't, there's a way in which, instead of having all of those, your vision, your project, your ideology, it has you instead. And we've all known people like this, and sometimes we've been people like this. I have in the past, where it's all about the filter of your ideology. Nothing else matters, right? And at that point, you're captured by an archetype, usually the archetype of justice, and it owns you. And then you become a little less than human. So do you have a sense of yourself apart from your role, project, whatever? That's the question. Another way of saying it is, do you have your cause or does it have you? Now, I mentioned this word last time, but I'll define it again. Do you see through Sarumanism? Does anybody remember what that was? Sarumanism. A couple of people nodded. Do you want to say what it is? You don't have to, but yes.
So as I understood it, it's having that power or vision that might be so numinous and so powerful that you become destructive with it, oppressive with it. It's the white knight that becomes.
Yeah. I think that's a piece of what he was getting at with that. It's J.R.R. Tolkien coined that word. That's part of it too. In his letters he said, you can't use the ring of power against your enemies without becoming your enemy. So to be more specific, Saruman is the, if you know Lord of the Rings, you know who this guy was. He was one of the good guys, one of the wizards who became corrupt. And Sarumanism is Tolkien's word for thinking that the only thing that makes change in the world is power, influence, money, military force, big things, right? And there's a really beautiful part in one of the Hobbit movies. I didn't like the movies that much, but the recent ones, but they had their moments. And there's a part where a scene occurs between Gandalf and Galadriel. Did I mention this last time? I hope I didn't. Okay, well, if I did, it's a repeat. But so these two characters are standing together. Galadriel is sort of like this wisdom goddess that we've been talking about, a Sophia figure, and very powerful. And Gandalf is obviously the wizard. And so there's a character named Bilbo who's a hobbit and not a hero. I mentioned last time this is all for non-heroes, right? Who's going off on a dangerous mission. And he doesn't want to, and he complains about it the whole time. Why am I doing this? I just want to be home. I just want to be back in Bag End. His last name is Baggins. And so knowing this, Galadriel asks Gandalf, why him? Why him? This unheroic, afraid guy who's like 3.5 feet tall. And so Gandalf's answer doesn't appear in the novel, The Hobbit, but it does appear in different forms in Tolkien's letters around this issue of Sarumanism. And so Gandalf says, most people, not most people, Saruman, actually naming him, Saruman believes that only great power can hold evil in check. But that is not what I have found. I found it as the small things, the ordinary deeds of everyday folk that hold the evil at bay. Simple acts of kindness and love. And he says, why, Bilbo? Because I'm afraid, and he gives me courage. And this is like one of the most powerful wizards in Middle-earth, you know? So that is the other side, the contra-Sarumanism side of all this. That, as Jung puts it, we make our era. We make our epic, rather. We make it with our choices, with the things that we do every day. And that's part of what Enchantivism is about, too. So a few other questions. Am I, let me put it that way, more committed to making allies than to punishing the oblivious by drenching them with bad news? I saw one of the evolutions of Al Gore's slideshow, An Inconvenient Truth, and when he trains climate awareness folks, and I know 3 of them now, actually 4 now that I think of it, there's some latitude with what they can do with the slideshow. And so the version that I saw... now I know another one. Good. And so in the version that I saw, it was about 95% bad news, and a little bit at the end about let's tax the oil companies or something like that, and things that people were doing. And so the person who presented it, when this was pointed out to him, said, I believe that when people are given the facts, that they will make better decisions. And I went, when in human history has that ever been true? You know, I mean, there are some people that will, but you have to have a lot of psychic muscle to stand that kind of bad news, and this is catastrophic news. It's not just bad news, right? So one of the reasons for Enchantivism is that this approach, from my point of view, is not effective, and it risks numbing people out further. And that's not to say that we don't need to see the bad news and step up to realizing how bad it is and all that. Sure we do. But we can tell bigger stories than that. And we can even work in a little bit of hope. And that might help some of us who can't stand that much catastrophe at least have a framework for understanding it and working with it. Can I repeat? Sure. Are you more committed to making allies? An enchantivist way of saying it might be inspiring people. More committed to making allies than punishing the oblivious by drenching them with bad news. Then there's other things to look for, like I'll put it in first person in that term, do I have a savior complex? Am I codependent? What about unconscious power drives? Jung pointed out that when you suppress certain things in yourself, like affection and love, it tends to show up as will to power, right? Do I have enough emotional and material support from friends and allies? As I mentioned in the first presentation, I've had lots of students who are activists, and a lot of them get burned out because they don't have sufficient support. Do you know as much about what you fight for as what you fight against? Do you have a basic faith in human nature? So that's the sort of self-inquiry that I would do. And I would watch dreams. The night before you start on something like this, what do your dreams have to say? All right. Now, moving on to this next part. So the whole prospect of self-care. Making relaxation periods, real ones. Watching your dreams, emotional, I mentioned that, emotional self-defense. I've always wanted to teach a course on emotional self-defense. That'd be fun. I used to do a little bit of that in the men's groups that I ran. But I mean things like not allowing yourself to be trashed by other people, how to deal with projective identification. In other words, when people put their unconscious emotional distress into you, if you don't know how to deal with this, you might think it's yours. And then you go, why does that one person that I always talk to depress me so much? Or why is it that I always feel like I lack faith in myself after this conversation with this group of people? That sort of thing. Well, you might be receiving what other people are putting into you without realizing it. Knowing how to deal with that, right? Activists have to put up with this a lot. And a lot of times it's not even subtle, it's direct hostility. Right? Caring for your body, sleep, exercise, things like that. Ecotherapy. So reconnecting with the natural world, which we all evolved in, and which we need to have at least a minimum amount of daily contact with. Being around plants and animals, being outside, being embodied, being fully in your flesh instead of driving your body like a car, all of those things. Being open, I just mentioned this at orientation here, being open to moments of joy. When you do this sort of work, sometimes it's easy, like I mentioned earlier, to focus on what's going wrong, but being open to moments of joy. Sometimes when we've been mistreated for a long time, childhood, whatever it is, one can become defensive and armored up, and so when you start to get joyful, you repress it because it's threatening. I would recommend not doing that. And there's something I wanted to mention too in this list. Being on the lookout for what, and I just mentioned this in class also, what Abraham Maslow calls a Jonah complex, by which he means being afraid of your own possibilities. Usually this looks like self-sabotage. And I haven't found, there's one line of psychological thinking about, oh, it's self-destructive and all that. Well, yeah, it is. It's self-sabotage, you know. I haven't found that very illuminating. But when you think of it as a form of self-protection that keeps you from stepping up to where you want to be in life, then you can say thank you to the protective side of you and move on anyway, right? So Jonah complex, that's Maslow's term for this. In this list, respecting fantasy and imagination. Jung says they're real, they are, as he found out. Having courage, not just for heroes. I was saying last time that activism can be heroic. The risks that are taken, the dangers, hitting it, you know, day after day, year after year, the opposition that you face from an entire culture, from the police, from the governments. So for people who don't want to do that sort of heroic work, even so, courage is important. Being able to have difficult conversations with people in small groups. Being able to do things like public speaking when you don't want to. That was a really hard one for me. I was terrified of that. Got shamed a lot in front of audiences when I was a kid, and it kind of lingered for a while. And then one day I went, the hell with this. I can't have this on my neck anymore. And so learning that the sky wouldn't fall when I got nervous, you know, that kind of thing. It's just practice. People sometimes say, what's the the method, the cure, and it's being up in front of people, like lots of times until you don't care if you get nervous, you know. But as part of having courage, not being overly thin-skinned, being able to be in the ambiguity, the uncertainty, the mess, not knowing exactly how things are going to turn out, but experimenting with them anyway. And I really like Jung's way of putting this. You can't wash a dog without getting wet. Right? Seeing through things like Sarumanism, seeing through the common, especially American idea, that unless you are one of millions of people with lots of money, you don't count, which is nonsense. That's one of the ways we stay psychologically in the child position and don't do things that we need to be doing. The power has always been with people, always. And so on this, seeing through, I wanted to give you, before I come to this, something from Tillich's book, The Courage to Be, where he addresses this to some extent. I love the way he puts it. He says, see if I can remember it correctly, it takes enormous courage to see through the lure of appearances. It takes enormous courage to see through the lure of appearances. The power of being that is manifest in such courage is so great that the gods tremble in fear of it. Wow. So, any questions about anything that I've just been over before we come up here? Yes?
It's more of a comment than
Yeah.
to the Jonah complex,
Yeah.
to the concept of courage. I learned this from Tara Moore's book, Playing Big. Two kinds of fear in Hebrew, two ways to say fear, pachad and yira. And pachad is that fear where you're imagining things that are going to happen and you're really scared for your safety. And yira is that, like, right before you leap into something big.
Yeah.
Possibility.
Yeah.
So oftentimes I do a gut check around fear, whether is this pachad, like,
Yeah.
or is this yira because I'm going to stand up and do something amazing and step into my life. So
Yeah.
that's been a useful tool.
That's great. That brings to mind the second time kind of fear that you were mentioning brings to mind that scene in the film The Matrix where Neo's in training and Morpheus leaps over that huge chasm between buildings. He tells him, "Free your mind," and then he makes the leap, right? And Neo is getting ready, and he's feeling that, the pre-leap fear, and he's talking to himself over and over, "Free your mind, free your mind." You know, I love that. All right, so that's the whole piece of not the entire, but that's an example of how to do some self-inquiry before we ever go into any of this stuff about making permanent change, making lasting change. So now we get to this. A while back, I was out walking, and I was thinking about my fantasy, the one that's followed me around all my life that I mentioned earlier, and it often has to do with the whole planet. And we're a planetary species at this point, so that makes sense. But I've often thought, what would a just, sustainable, delightful, inclusive, advanced world civilization look like? And so I've thought that it might need a name. And I wanted it to be something kind of fantastic and maybe a little science fiction-ish, you know. And so I was out walking, and the word Terrania kind of followed itself into my consciousness. And I was walking in the evening, the sun had gone down, and right when I thought this word, and I thought, I want to be an honorary member of that culture, right? And the largest meteor I ever saw in my entire life came streaming down toward the ocean so close I could hear it hissing through the air. And I went, wow. So I'm still not sure what all that means in the interpretive sense, but that was a big deal to me. So I went, okay, I like this word. So that's why I use it. Also, in terms of that, toward the end of the first presentation, and I'm going to give you this quotation one more time. I mentioned that I think it was toward the end of his life, H.G. Wells was asked who he thought he was. And he said, "I'm English by origin, but I'm early world man," in capital letters. "And I live in exile from the world community of my desire." That's what I think of when I think of this. So I figured, well, if nothing else, we can use it as an acronym. So I also mentioned last time, some of this is freely borrowing from Steve Eisenstadt's idea of archetypal activism. So a quick recap of that before we actually go through these steps. And then we're going to have to, let's see here. Oh yeah, good. We have another story coming on too. So in Steve's dream tending groups, oftentimes, as I mentioned last time, there's some sort of a powerful dream. Has anyone in here done dream tending? A couple of, oh good, a lot of people. Excellent. So a powerful dream, and we tend the idea that the dream isn't just about our own personal what have you, but that it's actually pointing towards something in the world. I dreamed some years ago of, I wasn't in dream tending when I did this, but I dreamed of a decomposing manatee. And in this dream, I was swimming next to it, and we were both kind of going along, and it looked really sick, and I thought it was dying. And you know how in dreams sometimes you have telepathic superpowers, or somebody else does in the dream, and so it was thinking at me one word from the manatee, which was hurry. That was one of the heaviest dreams I ever had. So a dream tending possibility would be that it's just not my inner manatee and all that. You can go through that inquiry and learn about yourself, but you don't stop there. You start looking into, well, how are the manatees in the world doing? What's going on with them, right? So it starts reconnecting the inner and the outer. And so you move from looking at the dream and being with it and letting the imagery express itself in its own voice and on its own terms, staying very carefully with the image, not really interpreting it too much, if at all, and if you do, at a later phase, so that the image has a voice first. And then eventually, after a period of reflection and sitting with it, getting to the point of asking oneself, now, is there some sort of creative action I can take as a result of this image? And last time I used Steve's example of a man in his dream tending practice dreaming about a historic church being torn down, and it turns out there was such a church in the town this man grew up in. And so his action was to organize local people and protect the church, and he did, and it stayed up. But there's lots of different ways to do this. And so that's part of where this comes from. So, and other things too, and I'll mention those as we go. So, in terms of this first item here, and these aren't discrete steps, I've just laid them out as a convenient order, but don't think of them as being fixed or rigid or anything like that. And some of them repeat, and you might go back to others and that sort of thing. But at the very beginning of all of this, number one, is some sort of a trigger. I need a better word for that. The prompt in the heart that bridges us into deep work in the world for some better future. Could be a small better future, a local better future, or it could be a big one, a Terrania better future. And I have an example of this. So we don't just stay with a dream, although a dream can be what does it for us. So Netta DeMaio owns and operates a ranch about maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours drive from here north, near Lompoc, and it's called Return to Freedom. And I like her example for a couple of reasons. One is that it shows how this works, but it also shows that sometimes there's a long delay between the event that triggers you, the urgent concern, and when you can actually do something about it. And also an awakening, like, oh, I didn't even realize at the time that was a big deal. Now I do, right? So when she was a little girl, she was watching TV, and she saw helicopters hunting wild horses. And that was very disturbing for her. And she didn't do anything with it, being, 8 or however old she was. So she went through an entire, upbringing, going to school. I think she was in the Hollywood fashion industry for a while. Imagine Artemis doing fashion That might be kind of how it was for her. She's as close to Artemis, I think, as anyone will ever get in the flesh. Moved past all of that, and then one day, and I can't remember why, something brought that image back to her. And she said, well, I can do something about this. So her and her family bought land and set this ranch up. Return to Freedom is a sanctuary for wild horses. So she moved from, it took a long time, she moved from the concern to the response. And if you're curious about her work, it's returntofreedom.org. I went on a tour at one point, and the rules are that the horses get the land, and there's minimum human interference. And so she got a small group of us together and told us, all right, well, you need to learn a little horse etiquette before you go up there, because these aren't horses for riding or things like that. They're on their own out there. They collect together in groups like they do in the natural world, and don't stare at them because it's rude, and also because horses see us with our eyes in the front of our heads as predators, so it scares them. And be quiet in your movements. And she directed us, so we went up in the hills, and she said, if they come visit us, that's up to them. We might not see any horses today, and that's just the breaks, you know. And so we went up there, and a band of horses got curious about us, and so Netta told us all to sit down, so we did. And eventually they ambled over and started hanging out with us. That was nice. And what struck me was how spirited they were compared to horses that I've seen in other settings where they're penned up. It was a huge difference. So she created that out of this, number one, the event that got into her heart. And I mention heart emphatically because there's something that gets to us. It may be a news item, it may be some event that happens to us, something in our family's relationship, what have you. But it's one of those moments where it goes right through you. And the idea here is to tend that not only as your own personal wake-up, but also as a summons from the world itself. So that's the first. Second, engagement. So here's the existential dimension. The tendency a lot of us have, and sometimes the trigger event can be joyful, sometimes it can be disturbing, what have you, but it's going to be life-changing. And the tendency that a lot of us have, as Joseph Campbell pointed out, is to ignore it. When this shows up for heroes, it can be a really big event, like a burning bush big event, and the hero has a choice. Do I enter the hero's journey or not? And Campbell liked to say, where is he? There he is. He liked to say that in some cases you can not enter, but if you do that, chances are it's going to call you again at another time, and next time it'll be louder. And if you refuse again, it'll be louder, right? In a more non-heroic way of thinking about this, a more non-heroic psychology, or post-heroic for people who've been heroes and are coming to the other side of it, engagement has to do with whatever form this call takes, saying yes to it. There has to be a yes from our side of things. There's a beautiful passage in one of Rollo May's books where he says sometimes forces for growth and change only are let loose when we make a conscious decision, which is the reverse of how some of us think of it. I need to go and be in therapy so that I can make better decisions, which is a laudable goal, but it can also be a way of not making decisions if you let it go too long. So here, the idea is that to say yes to it is to release other forces that will support you going forward. Engagement. Reflection on what resources we have for restoring whatever it is that we're looking at. There's a part of archetypal activism that Steve talks about in his dream tending book where he says to get curious. There's a tendency when whatever this cause looks like, there's a tendency to go into a moralistic position with it, which at some point might be necessary, but it can block inquiry. So the idea here reflection is to be able to see through it a little bit to the underlying images, fantasies, forces. And I'll give you a quick example of this just right off the top of my head. We all know that global warming is causing huge amounts of suffering already, right? It's not in the future, it's now, right? And so a way of thinking about it reflectively, when we feel our feelings about it, when we give ourselves permission to have all of those reactions to it. But this sort of reflective moment would be to look for the images in the event. And this can be different for different people. There's no one set that's correct or right, you know. So when I think of global warming, one of the images that comes to me is of that we've somehow turned the Earth into a huge alchemical vessel, and we're turning the fire up too high. And so in alchemical thought, the higher the fire goes, the more stuff starts cooking and bubbling. Now the upside of this, if there is an upside, is that transformation happens faster. Innovation is quicker when the fire's turned up. And in our situation, it has to be. We have to really get going about all this. So when I think about that image of the alchemical vessel, it gives me approaches and tools and perspectives that I wouldn't have if I just thought of it as a horrible catastrophe. So that's part of the reflection too. What's really happening here? I mentioned Artemis in terms of my friend Netta DeMaio. Oh, incidentally, her first name, as you know, if you've been one of my students, I'm fascinated by what people's names are, because I think it often has a lot to do with what our inner self is up to. Her name, Netta, I didn't know what that name was, and so shortly after I met her, I said, "What does your first name mean?" And she laughed, and she said, "Sanctuary." Of course it does, right? Naturally. So if you think of the mythic image of Artemis looking after the horses, it makes sense, right? So that's what I mean by reflection, looking for the deeper part of all this in whatever it is that grabs you by the heart. Relationship. So this is not a go it alone approach. That's a good way to get burned out really quick, and also a good way to get inflated. So discussion with other people. This is what's up for me. This is what's cooking in my own alchemical vessel. This is how I'm holding it. And you know, some things just emerge only through conversation. If I have dreams that give me some trouble, I talk to people about them. Usually more than one person. And if you've ever been in a dream group, you see how this works, right? So be in conversation, and also to get support as well. Because some of this is really heavy. If something from the world is actually getting into your heart, that's a big load. So very necessary to have relationship with others. Action. So there's a planning phase too when we're with other people. What's my response going to be? What do I feel called to do about this? How large should it be? Should it just be something small? Can it be something that's sort of time limited, like write an article, or do a video, or what have you? Or should it be a whole campaign? Should I organize a lot of people? Should I get funding for it? All those planning questions. So here we bring the rational mind in, and Jung would say the sensate function too. The part of us that is grounded and then says, here's the plan, here are the facts, this is my timeline for this, these are the benchmarks I have for it, if it's going to be that big a project, right? So this is the rational planning piece. And we do that with other people too, not just alone. Actually carrying out the plan, moving from reflection to implementation. Whatever it is that we actually do in the world, buying the ranch, writing the article, whatever it is, right? Networking, spreading the news about the action, telling people about it. Not necessarily calling the press, not necessarily the part in the movie Contact, where Ellie Arroway hears the signal, the extraterrestrial signal, and one of her scientists says, "Who are we going to call now?" And she says, "Everybody," right? Not necessarily that, or although it might be, but some sort of spreading the word in whatever way we feel called to do that. 7, inquiry, assessing the results of the action. What worked? what didn't, what was surprising, and for this assessment also looking at our dreams, right? Here's a very small example of this, very small. Some years ago, I was looking for a psychotherapy internship, and that was my way of kind of getting out more in the world at that time. This was a long time ago. And so I interviewed with a psychologist who seemed pretty solid, and I went, okay, so my conscious impression is that this is workable. It seems like a good arrangement. She seems really, she's years of experience. I think I can learn a lot from her. She seems like she'd be a good teacher for me. The other interns seem good. What's my unconscious have to say about it? So I went to sleep, and I dreamed that I was at the top of a skyscraper that was on fire, and it was burning to the ground, and I dove through some sort of an escape hatch inside the building and went sliding down, and I got out right before the building fell down. So this was long enough ago that I don't remember how I rationalized away this dream, but it could have served me as an assessment, the inquiry part up here, for what I was going to do next. I had done the interview. Now what, right? I ignored it. So it turned out that the psychologist was quasi-psychotic. She was violating a number of really set-in-stone ethical guidelines that are absolutely basic to the practice of psychotherapy, and doing it in a way that that was just astoundingly open. Right? Not even an attempt to hide it, like cold calling former clients. You need more therapy and stuff like that, right? Unbelievable. So I was able to find a loophole in the contract, and I got out of the internship. It collapsed a couple of months later for legal inquiries that were made and other interns jumping ship and things like that. So in this kind of work, when it has to do with actually trying to improve the world somehow, it's even more important to have some sort of an assessment about how things went. Lastly, advancing. So going to the next phase. There's a tendency for some of us not to follow up, but we need to. Part of my upbringing had to do with, I come from both birth and adoptive military families, and it took me quite a few years to realize that that was actually very useful. I had not served in the armed forces, although I've done therapy with lots of soldiers and commanding officers. But aside from being useful on that level, I realized that it was a good education in strategy and tactics. So in the nonviolent use of strategy and tactics. So one of the things I think that kind of education can offer action in the world is you got to follow up. If you do something successfully, so-called win a battle, follow up, follow up, follow up, right? Sun Tzu says that thousands of years ago, follow up. So that's the last phase, and this can loop. So that's my basic framework for how to do this. I'm going to stop right there. Actually, can we have the next slide? And before I go through this, any questions about what I just went over? Yes. Yeah. This is actually included in this. We sent out links by email with the slideshows, containing the slideshows. So it already went out. We could send it out again. Yeah. Yeah, that's in there. Yeah. I could try. Let's see here. Is that all right on your end? You can still see the part you need to see, right? Yeah. Okay. That any better? All right. But yeah, you should. The links have copies of these. So.
How long ago did you come up with the name, and when did you do that?
That was about, I think about 3 years ago. Yeah. Enchantivism is more recent. All right, so this is just attitudes that I think are helpful, not only for what I just showed you, but in general for trying to bridge inner and outer and reflection with action in the world in service to better possibilities. So this part I'll go through kind of quickly, actually. Enthusiasm. So keeping your energy and interest high, even when you don't feel like working on things sometimes, right? The students know this from having to write papers. Aspirations, that's the motivational. Aspiration, the imaginal dimension. Dreaming of how things could be and trusting those dreams. Sometimes that's the hardest one. Third, responsibility, which is the ethical dimension. Standing for your principles and aspirations. There's lots of people in the world who often remind me of the folkloric image of the vampire. And they'll sink their teeth into your neck and drain you of all the blood of your inspiration and visionary capability if you allow them to. So that's when you need to wear like garlic around your neck or what have you. 4, tenacity, which is the intentional dimension. Keeping at what matters in spite of obstacles. There's a strange line of thinking that some people make a start on something and then they run into an obstacle and tell themselves, well, maybe this isn't meant to be. Maybe I shouldn't do this. Possibly. It kind of depends what the obstacle is, but I would be open to the possibility that what it really means is that you're going through an initiation and you have to punch your way through. Sometimes it's that, right? It's testing you. There's a reason that there are threshold guardians. And as Campbell pointed out, in a more heroic setting, if you can't get past the threshold guardians, maybe you shouldn't go on the journey. So it works that way with this too. So obstacles possibly are the ways that you get tougher or more determined to do whatever aspirational work you're really up to. And the funny thing about them too is that they tend to turn into helpers, as again Campbell pointed out. Gandhi, who did very heroic work in the world, was fond of saying that some of his best allies were originally his enemies, who were impressed by his soul force and then came over to his side. And then last, hopefulness for fair, resilient, diverse, earth-loving forms of lasting, beloved community. Hope in many different languages means not just to be waiting for something, but it means to actually expect it to occur. Esperar, not just to hope, but to wait and to expect. I've sometimes thought of this in terms of men's work, in seeing court-referred clients who were temporarily regressing and telling them in group, you know, I'm irritated with you doing this kind of behavior right now because you're better than this. You have the potential to be better men, and you're not living up to it. And I have hope that you can, right? So when I read the news sometimes, geez, it's just so awful. And in my Enchantivist perspective, I read through it, and I just think, we're better than this. We can do better. We have done better than this. So holding ourselves up to that level. So that's that piece. Now, I have that raven picture down there as a little mini story to tell. And let me do a time check here. Okay, good. So, and then I want to do another exercise with all of you, more around a discussion of triggers. So I taught for a week at Schumacher College, and one of the things we were looking at was how the world itself, the earth itself, supports our efforts, right? And there's all these great fairy tales, folk tales, and I'm thinking particularly of, they're in all different traditions. I'm kind of imagining a few from the European and German traditions especially, where somebody says yes to something in the natural world, and all of a sudden the birds come out, or some other animal in it supports you in your efforts. It helps you out, right? From the Greek stories, you know, Psyche gets in trouble and the ants show up and start helping her, that kind of thing. It's in a lot of stories, you know. So we were floating this idea at Schumacher, and we were out walking on Dartmoor, which is a great place to be. When you're out there, especially if there's mist, it's like, wow, this is where The Hound of the Baskervilles was set, that old Sherlock Holmes story where all this great local ghost stories are happening, and ancient rock underneath. And I was out there with Stephen Harding, who's the ecologist who directs Schumacher, and we were team teaching. So I was giving people some of the experiential exercises and talking about the voice of place and reimagining synchronicity as sort of a gesture of the place itself, the response of the earth to what we do. And so I was doing that part, the psychological, eco-psychological part, and then Stefan was giving them the ecology part. So he was mentioning that there was this huge bubble of granite in the ground underneath us. And I was thinking about how, in terms of patterns, so there's this big bubble with a hollow space in the middle of it, underneath the whole area, millions and millions of years old. And the college itself is set up around a hearth in a circle. It's not circular, but the buildings make a mandala, right? A square mandala. And a lot of the paintings that were up on the walls at that time had the same theme, some sort of a periphery around a center. And I kept thinking, it's amazing how pervasive this is out here. It starts in the ground, way before there were human beings here. It's in the architecture, it's in the paintings. I was asking the students, what are you dreaming about when you're here? And you could see it in their dreams. So it gave me the idea to go, while we were out on Dartmoor, to stand in a circle at one point out near those wonderful, huge stones that are out there. And we got in a circle. And I said to them, I'd like you to imagine that you're not only here. Schumacher's a very activist-oriented school, so it's for people that want to actually do ecological work in the world and social justice work. I said, imagine that you're here not only to do this work, which you're called to do, and you're seeing this landscape that you want to protect. I want you to imagine for a moment that the landscape and the animals and the earth are watching you. That you are yourself being witnessed. And just sit with that. So we were standing in a circle. So it took maybe 20 seconds, and a huge raven came flying in. And it did a perfect circle around the entire group, slowly, and then it flew away. And everybody went, whoa. So that was our moment of enchantment right there. And everybody who was present, even the more skeptical people who were like, why are we out here doing this, because of the mood of the place itself and the feeling of us being together, everybody felt like that was a response. So I mention that because this isn't just us doing this work, it's the world doing work too. And maybe even, as Joanna Macy would point out, the world working through us. And by the way, if you get a chance to see her while she's still presenting, you should, if you haven't already.